الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another episode of Quran Circle 11, where we listen to Quran being recited in a perfect way so that we can learn, inshallah ta'ala, and benefit from the recitation, and also focusing on the subject of women in Quran. Not a particular subject, but in general, how it's mentioned in the Quran with all different ways, whether it's of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honored women in the Quran, and that the responsibility and the purpose of life for both men and women are equal, matters of belief, matters of ibadah, and what's unique is unique for each kind. And some of the figures that are mentioned in the Quran, whether it's believing and righteous women or wicked and evil ones, which is the same as men, but to get to realize how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just, and He subhanahu wa ta'ala honors whoever He wills, and He also leads astray whoever He wills by His knowledge, by His justice, by His mercy subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we are still the last passage, inshallah ta'ala, that we will listen from Surah Yusuf, something that for us also to learn and to remember, and to be warned against what would be the like and the life of the people in certain societies and certain environments, and to take lesson and to follow the righteous ones, as Yusuf alayhi salam was present in an environment where people are led by their desires, and there was so much of evil actions being there, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected him by being obedient to Allah. And at all times what matters really is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His help towards the believers. So we continue inshallah ta'ala with one passage of the Quran in Surah Yusuf, and then we'll move on to Surah Ibrahim and Surah Al-Hijr inshallah ta'ala. But before we do that, I would like to introduce the reciters with us. We have Sheikh As'ad Al-Hawi. Welcome to the program, Barakallah Feek. And Sheikh Ayman Abdul Mun'im. Allah barak feekum, alaykum assalam wa barakatuh. And Sheikh Ahmad Rajab. Jazakumullah khairan for coming, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for each and every one of us. So we'll start inshallah ta'ala with verses in Surah Yusuf, verse number 50 to verse number 55. 50 to 55 in Surah Yusuf, and Sheikh As'ad, go ahead and recite for us inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وقال الملك ائتوني به فلما جاءه الرسول قال ارجع إلى ربك فاسأله ما بال النسوة اللاتي قطعن أيديهن إن ربي بكيدهن عليم قال ما خطبكن إذ راوتن يوسف عن نفسه قلن حاش لله ما علمنا عليه من سوء قالت امرأة العزيز الآن حصحص الحق أنا راودته عن نفسه وإنه لمن الصادقين ذلك ليعلم أني لم أخنه بالغيب وأن الله لا يهدي كيد الخائنين وما أبرئ نفسي إن النفس لأمارة بالسوء إلا ما رحم ربي إن ربي غفور رحيم وقال الملك ائتوني به أستخلصه لنفسي فلما كلمه قال إنك اليوم لدينا مكين أمين قال اجعلني على خزائن الأرض إني حفيظ عليم.
ما شاء الله. ربنا يبارك فيك. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. So this is a part of the story of Yusuf alayhi salam after he spent time in prison, being innocent, being in prison for a crime that he did not commit. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most wise. So towards, as we know the story and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed for Yusuf alayhi salam to be freed from prison, but as it's mentioned in the details that is mentioned and great benefits. So when the king, he sent a messenger to Yusuf alayhi salam after he interpreted the dream to the king, and after the king realized that there is someone here in the prison that they can benefit from. So Yusuf alayhi salam, being an honorable person, that he refused just to walk out of the prison when he had a chance, but rather he wants to prove that he's innocent. He wants to prove to the people and for the people to see that he is not just someone that happened to leave the prison even though he's a criminal, but rather to show them that he was innocent. So he sent back the messenger to ask the king what happened or what's the matter with these women, those who were the reason for him to be in prison. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the king also, he knows their ways and plotting that they did against him. So it seems like they were brought in front of the king or in front of the judge, and they were asked, did you try to seduce Yusuf alayhi salam, and the fault is yours and not him? Then they said, we did not know anything of evil of him, to prove his innocently. And then the wife of Al-Aziz, she's the one that then she said, this is now the truth is clear, and I'm the one that tried to seduce him. So now the truth is declared and he is the truthful one. And then she said, this is in verse number 52, that she said that for him to know that I did not betray him when he was not present. So she repented to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from her sin, and also can also give the meaning referring to her husband, that she did not betray her husband. She did not commit the crime of adultery, but she would just try to seduce Yusuf alayhi salam, and that was the end of it. And this is how she stated and how the matter is clear, that the betrayal ones, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not guide their affairs. At certain point, their affairs will have to be exposed. So that's why those who want to betray, those who want to plot, they might receive some benefits in the beginning, but it goes around and then at the end they will be exposed unless they repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it shows that how the human being and the weakness within the human beings is something that we need to recognize. And nafs, oneself, is always commanding the person to do evil. And when a person knows that about himself, then he needs to seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to be obedient to Allah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed his favor upon Yusuf alayhi salam, and he was well established on the face of earth. And that shows that to be established and to be firm upon what is good, it has to go through trials first. It did not happen from the first instant, but rather he had to be tried, and he entered the prison and he left the prison. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala afterwards gave the honor of Yusuf alayhi salam, and what matters is what happens at the end. So this is with regards to Surah Yusuf, and maybe we can revisit it in some other times inshallah ta'ala. But then after that we'll go through verses in Surah Ibrahim. Surah Ibrahim and verses 35 to verse number 41. And Sheikh Ayman, go ahead and recite for us inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وإذ قال إبراهيم رب اجعل هذا البلد آمنا واجنبني وبني أن نعبد الأصنام رب إنهن أضللن كثيرا من الناس فمن تبعني فإنه مني ومن عصاني فإنك غفور رحيم ربنا إني أسكنت من ذريتي بواد غير ذي زرع عند بيتك المحرم ربنا إني أسكنت من ذريتي بواد غير ذي زرع عند بيتك المحرم ربنا ليقيموا الصلاة فاجعل أفئدة من الناس تهوي إليهم وارزقهم من الثمرات لعلهم يشكرون ربنا إنك تعلم ما نخفي وما نعلن وما يخفى على الله من شيء في الأرض ولا في السماء الحمد لله الذي وهب لي على الكبر إسماعيل وإسحاق إن ربي لسميع الدعاء رب اجعلني مقيم الصلاة ومن ذريتي رب اجعلني مقيم الصلاة ومن ذريتي ربنا وتقبل دعاء ربنا اغفر لي ولوالدي وللمؤمنين يوم يقوم الحساب.
ما شاء الله, barakallahu feek. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. Surah Ibrahim, and in these verses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions Ibrahim alayhi salam and having built the first house of worship, the Kaaba, and making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give security to this holy city of Makkah and to protect him and his offsprings from worshipping idols. And the fact that these idols that people worship besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, many people, they were deviated as a result of this, and stating that whoever follows his way, then he is one of him, loyal to him, and whoever disobey him, asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness and the mercy of Allah. The point here that the verses were mentioned, and what's mentioned about women in the Quran and in the verses, the fact that Ibrahim alayhi salam, he left his wife in a place, a barren land, which is the place where the Kaaba is, before it was built, before he returned back and building it with his son. But the fact that his wife and his firmness upon the faith and being strong in such a way, and the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam and his wife, as is stated in the hadith of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, something that we should learn, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the strength of the wife of Ibrahim alayhi salam, Hagar, with her son Ismail, when he left them in a barren land. And when he was leaving, he took them to that place when there's no sign of life whatsoever, no water, no trees, no food, no provisions, nothing except a bag of water that he gave and he left with them, and some few dates or so, as it's mentioned in some of the narrations. And when he was about to leave, and he was commanded not to even to speak to her. And we know how the husband and the wife, and they have affection towards one another. But this is the command of Allah, and the outcome that came as a result of that. And when she told them, is this something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered you to do? He just nodded his head, and she said, "Then, therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would never let us down." Relying upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sincerely. And you know the rest of the story, when she went back and forth between the Mount of As-Safa and Al-Marwa, looking for water, looking for any sign for her crying son. And then the water gushes from underneath his feet with the water of Zamzam. And then the fact that if we go ahead and fast forward to our day to day and what we do in Umrah and Hajj, and the fact that we go between the Safa and the Marwa and we run in certain portions in the bottom part of the valley, all of that is what? Is to commemorate this act of obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that this one woman did. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the entire ummah of the Prophet ﷺ to follow what she did. And that amount of sincerity, the amount of devotion, the amount of tawakkul and relying upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how it affected nations to come. All of that is to show again the strength of the iman in her heart. And that's why when he made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as it's mentioned in the hadith, this is when he left them and he went behind the mountain when he can see them, and he left them alone. It's something that is not easy for someone to do such a thing, but this is the command of Allah, knowing that the outcome definitely is what's best for them. And he made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, saying, "Oh Allah, I put my offsprings, his wife and his child, in a valley that has no life whatsoever, no plants, no food, no provisions, by the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the sacred house of Allah." What is the first thing that he made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for when it comes to his family? Did not say, "Oh Allah, save them from harm, oh Allah, provide for them." The first thing that he said, "Rabbana liyuqimu as-salah." Oh Allah, let them establish the salah. That's the most important thing. This is the most important concern that a man should have towards his wife and towards his children, is to establish the salah. That's the first thing. That's the purpose of life. And then have the hearts of the people to pour to that place where nobody would want to ever go to a place like this. No signs of life whatsoever. And even till today, when people go to Mecca, materialistically, it doesn't have anything. Nice sceneries, trees, greens, that does not exist there. It's all desert. And still the hearts of the believers, it's the most visited place on the face of earth. All of that by the dua of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And then the third thing is, وَارْزُقْهُمْ مِنَ الثَّمَرَاتِ, and provide for them from the produce and the provisions from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But for what reason? لَعَلَّهُمْ يَشْكُرُونَ, for them to be grateful to Allah. As you see here, if we really Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in our hearts the reality of this, then we will see the purpose of our life with the dua of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and that should have an effect in our life. This is the concern that we should have, and this is the quality of the believing women. And for us, for the believing sisters, for the Muslims, to follow the way and the example of the wife of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and for the men to follow the example of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and to establish the purpose of our life. And the dua goes on with this, more of the verses as we heard, and asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make him again establish the salah, him and his offsprings, and to accept the dua. And oh Allah, forgive his sin and forgive the sin of his parents, and to the believers till the day of reckoning, which is the day of judgment. So with that is being mentioned, and the lessons to be learned, and the importance of that, and what's mentioned about the wife of Ibrahim alayhi salam as part of what women are mentioned in the Quran, we go to the next surah, inshallah ta'ala, which is Surah Al-Hijr, and we'll go through verses 57 to verse number 77. And Sheikh Ahmed, go ahead and recite for us, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. قال فما خطبكم أيها المرسلون. قالوا إنا أرسلنا إلى قوم مجرمين إلا آل لوط إنا لمنجوهم أجمعين إلا امرأته قدرنا إنها لمن الغابرين فلما جاء آل لوط المرسلون قال إنكم قوم منكرون قالوا بل جئناك بما كانوا فيه يمترون وأتيناك بالحق وإنا لصادقون فأسر بأهلك بقطع من الليل واتبع أدبارهم ولا يلتفت منكم أحد فأسر بأهلك بقطع من الليل واتبع أدبارهم ولا يلتفت منكم أحد وامضوا حيث تؤمرون وقضينا إليه ذلك الأمر أن دابر هؤلاء مقطوع مصبحين وجاء أهل المدينة يستبشرون قال إن هؤلاء ضيفي فلا تفضحون واتقوا الله ولا تخزون قالوا أولم ننهك عن العالمين قال هؤلاء بناتي إن كنتم فاعلين لعمرك إنهم لفي سكرتهم يعمهون فأخذتهم الصيحة مشرقين فجعلنا عاليها سافلها وأمطرنا عليهم حجارة من سجيل إن في ذلك لآيات للمتوسمين وإنها لبسبيل مقيم إن في ذلك لآية للمؤمنين.
ما شاء الله. بارك الله فيك. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. Here in Surah Al-Hijr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned again the story of Lut alayhi salam and his people, and the role of women in this, whether it's in a good way or in an evil way, as the case with every human being. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He sent Lut alayhi salam to warn His people from the evil action that they do and to call them to the oneness of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as we heard in the verses that in these particular verses, when the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came upon the people, and He commanded Lut alayhi salam to leave the town that he's in, and not to even to look back and to go straight, and this is in the last part of the night, and that the fact of the punishment will be upon the people right after this, meaning in the morning. And when that was said to Lut alayhi salam and the people of the town, they came to him. Why? Because of the guests, those who came to Lut alayhi salam, the angels in the form of human beings, and they were good looking, and the people they were upon this evil actions where they fulfilled their desires, men towards men. So they wanted his guests, and he tried to forbid that from his people. And he said to them, and this is what also women are mentioned here, he says, قَالَ هَؤُلَاءِ بَنَاتِي إِن كُنْتُمْ فَاعِلِينَ. These are, meaning the women of his people, not his own daughters, but rather the women, those who are part of the city. This is what is best for you, meaning men to marry women, not men towards men and women towards women, but rather men to marry women. This is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you. Fulfill your desires in the proper way through marriage between men and women. This is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created things. But their intoxications overpowered them, and as a result of that, the punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came unto them, and they were severely punished, as we know, with the stones. So that's why these are signs from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for those who are able to derive from this the benefits and the outcome of things. And it's not something that is only happened in the past. This is something that is repeated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for people to be warned against evil actions. And that's why only the believers, they benefit from such verses of the Quran and stories mentioned in the Quran. So, and as mentioned before, the wife of Lut alayhi salam, she was punished with the people just for the fact that she approved what they were upon and did not believe that this is something that is wrong. So this is some of the benefits that we hear and from these verses and from previous verses, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honored the believers, whether they are men and women, and the important roles that they play in their life, and to fulfill and to protect one's fitrah and one's pure nature, and to be steadfast upon this, because this is one of the objectives of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is to bring the human beings back to their pure nature, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created them with certain things that makes it easy for them to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. We'll continue inshallah ta'ala next time with more of verses in the Quran that talks about women. But before we end, I would like to thank the reciters. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for coming and reciting these beautiful recitations. Until next time, I leave you with the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم وقلوبهم